On a wagon road in Lincoln County, New Mexico, in February of 1878, a rancher named John Tunstall was shot dead, and the money behind the store he had just opened belonged to John Simpson Chisum, the man behind the largest cattle operation in the United States. A young cattle guard on Chisum's own payroll watched it happen and did nothing. History remembers him as Billy the Kid. But the outlaw is not this film's subject. The cattle king who financed the war around him is. By the time Tunstall bled out, Chisum's mark ran on nearly 80,000 head of cattle spread across 200 miles of the Pecos, an empire of grass and water no other rancher in the country could match, backed by the private bank he ran. That bank paid for a mark no rustler in the territory could copy, for $150,000 bled from the herd before the shooting ever started, for the day Chisum sold his own empire and kept running it just the same, and for 2 daughters the record barely names. History remembers the outlaw. The man who financed him disappeared from the story almost entirely, and this film is the account of how. Chapter 1. The Contractor Who Wanted the Range. It was 1837, and the Chisum family crossed into a Texas where the young republic had not yet drawn a fence line worth the name, 3 years before the boy who would come to claim more of that range than any rancher alive was old enough to ride it without someone watching him do it. He had been born in 1824, 13 years earlier, into a household with no cattle empire behind it and no bank account waiting for him. What the family carried across the border instead was a habit of paperwork, ledgers, land claims, the kind of careful accounting a raw frontier needed almost as badly as it needed water. By 1852, that habit had turned into a post. Chisum served as the clerk of Lamar County, Texas, for 2 years, filing deeds, recording debts, and learning exactly how a man's claim to property was made to hold up on paper before a single animal of his own ever wore a mark. It was an unglamorous apprenticeship, 2 years behind a courthouse desk instead of on a horse, and it left almost no trace in the popular memory of the man who would later run the largest cattle operation in the country. There was no herd to point to yet, no range with his name attached to it, only stacks of county paper passing across a desk and a young man reading every line of it. But the clerk's desk was where he learned the lesson the open range never taught anyone directly. In a country without fences, paper decided who owned what, and the man who understood the paper first had an advantage no amount of grass could match on its own. Other men on that frontier would learn to read a brand or track a trail. Chisum learned, 2 full years before he owned a single head of cattle, how a debt was recorded, how a deed was contested, and how a claim survived a courthouse argument once it was written down in the right hand. He left the clerk's office in 1854 with no cattle to his name and no land recorded as his either, only the knowledge of how credit moved and how a claim held once it was written down. Texas in those years offered a kind of ownership no Eastern courthouse would have recognized. A man staked his herd not to a deed, but to a brand, and the government backed him only so far as the ledgers he had just spent 2 years keeping for other people. Chisum understood, better than most of the men who would soon crowd onto the same range, that the open country rewarded whoever controlled the paperwork behind it, not merely whoever ran the most cattle across it. That lesson sat unused for a few more years, while Chisum built the smaller, quieter foundation an empire needs before anyone notices it is being built at all. A herd small enough to count by hand, a name not yet attached to any trail or any war, a habit of writing everything down that would one day put him behind a bank counter as easily as behind a cattle drive. The range was still open in every direction, unclaimed and unfenced, and the country around him was filling with men who wanted a piece of it the same way he did. What none of them yet had was Chisum's particular head start, 2 years of knowing exactly how ownership was proven in a place where almost nothing was owned outright. By 1860, that head start was about to become a herd. Chapter 2. 5,000 head and no fences. By 1860, the head start had become a herd. Chisum ran 5,000 cattle across the open range of Texas that year, animals he valued at $35,000, the first sum the record would ever attach to his name, and the figure every later number in this story would be measured against. None of it rested on a deed. There was no fence anywhere on the ground he grazed, no courthouse plat marking where his grass ended and a neighbor's began, and no title he could carry into a bank and borrow against the way a farmer further east might borrow against an acre he actually owned. What he had instead was the same instrument he had spent 2 years filing on behalf of other men in Lamar County, a mark burned into a living animal's hide, and the unwritten custom among ranchers scattered across hundreds of miles of unfenced Texas that a registered mark, once respected by the men around it, functioned as a deed the courts had simply never gotten around to drawing. A cow could wander 30 miles between one roundup and the next and still come home to the right owner, not because any government said so, but because every rider on that range had agreed to read the same iron the same way. It was an economy built on grass no one had purchased and water no one controlled, and it rewarded exactly the kind of man Chisum had trained himself to become before he owned a single cow. A rancher with more cattle than his neighbors did not need more acreage recorded in his name at any courthouse. He needed more grass his herd could reach before another outfit's did, riders enough to hold a mark across open country, and a memory sharp enough to know, at roundup, which calf belonged to which cow when no fence had kept them apart all season. Custom, not law, decided that an unbranded calf running beside a marked cow belonged to whoever got a hot iron on it first, and Chisum's crews rode every mile of unfenced range with that custom in mind. 5,000 head was already more than most Texas outfits could claim in 1860, and it was nowhere near what Chisum intended to run. The herd could grow only as fast as he could push it into grass. Nobody else had reached yet, and every mile further west was a mile with fewer competing marks on it, and also a mile further from the courthouse, where his old training in paperwork could do him any good if a dispute ever went to a judge instead of to a gun. That was the trade the open range asked of every man who ran cattle on it in 1860. More grass in exchange for less protection. Chisum took the trade without hesitation. The same unfenced country that let a former county clerk build a 5,000 head herd out of nothing but a mark and a claim also left that herd standing in open ground the moment anyone with more riders or a longer reach decided the grass was worth taking. There was no sheriff riding line camp to stop them, and no fence to slow them down if they tried. Raiding parties still crossed that country on a calendar no rancher set. So did outfits with fewer scruples about whose iron belonged on a maverick. A mark and a claim would not be enough to hold what Chisum meant to build. He would need a partner willing to push cattle into country even he had not yet dared to claim, and the man who was about to offer him exactly that partnership would not live to see where it led. Chapter 3. The partner the Comanches killed. The partnership arrived on a trail 2 other men had already carved out of nothing but nerve. Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving had spent the middle of the 1860s pushing herds along a route they had blazed themselves, west across dry country and north into territory that had no cattle in it because no one had ever dared to put cattle there. It was Loving who rode east to ask whether a Texas rancher running 5,000 head under a clean mark wanted his cattle driven in with theirs. Chisum said yes before the man had finished asking. The ground ahead was worth more than the danger behind, and a rancher who had already watched other outfits thin out to raiders on the open range understood precisely what he was agreeing to. He was agreeing to a country with no law in it at all, not even the unwritten law of custom that governed a Texas range. West of the Pecos, a marked animal belonged to whoever could hold it at gunpoint, and the men who rode that ground against Comanche bands, moving on a calendar no rancher controlled, were not gambling with cattle. They were gambling with their own lives, every mile past the last settlement that could send help. In 1867, the gamble came due. Loving rode ahead of the herd the way a scout always rode ahead of a herd entering country its drivers did not yet control, and Comanche raiders found him before his own men could reach him. He did not survive it. The partner who had ridden east a year earlier to offer a Texas clerk, turned rancher a stake in a future neither of them had yet built, was dead before that future arrived, buried in ground 300 miles from the range he had helped Chisum imagine. If that had been the whole of it, the story would have ended there too. One more name added to the long ledger of men the open range had taken instead of made. It was not the whole of it. Loving's death was the beginning of an arrangement that would carry Chisum's cattle and Chisum's name farther than either partner had planned to carry them alone. Goodnight did not leave the country that had killed his partner. He rode back into it, and in 1868 he brought Chisum the arrangement Loving had died before he could finish, a standing agreement to drive Chisum's cattle west and north, year after year, built to survive the same ground that had already claimed one of the two men who founded it. Chisum signed on in the same spirit he had agreed to the first offer, without waiting to see whether the country had gotten any gentler. It had not. Nothing about the range between the Texas settlements and the territory beyond it had softened since Loving died on it, and both surviving partners knew it before either put a pen to the agreement. What the arrangement gave Chisum was an outlet for a herd about to outgrow anything one man could watch personally, the way he had watched 5,000 head in 1860. What it did not give him was a way to keep that herd his own once it scattered across open country with no fence and no deed to prove whose brand belonged on which animal. A rider could burn a mark into a hide. A rustler with a hot iron and an hour alone with a maverick could burn a different one on top of it, and a court 300 miles away would have no way to say which mark came first. Chisum had built an empire on custom and grazing rights before he had ever needed to defend it at scale. The scale was arriving now, on Goodnight's trail, faster than the old custom could hold it together. He needed something no rustler could alter with a running iron and a spare hour. He did not have it yet. The man who would have known how to build it had spent 30 years learning the trail that killed him, and he was already 300 miles behind, in ground that had no marker on it at all. Chapter 4. The Mark. No rustler could copy. The thing Chisum needed did not arrive from a man. It arrived from paper, the standing arrangement Goodnight had brought him in 1868, built to carry the herd west and north for as long as the trail would hold. A delivery agreement running that many years across that much open country needed one thing above all: a way to prove, at any inspection point from the Pecos to the railheads in Kansas, which animal belonged to which outfit. A running iron and an hour alone with a stray calf could put any brand on any hide. Chisum had watched it happen to smaller outfits his whole working life. A mark altered in the dark, a court 3 counties away with no way to say which iron had come first. So, between 1868 and 1871, while the Goodnight arrangement carried his cattle north, Chisum settled on 2 marks instead of 1, worn together on the same animal. The first was the long rail, a single unbroken line burned the length of the hide, plain to read and hard to blend into another rancher's brand without leaving a scar an inspector would notice. The second mark did not go on the hide at all. It went on the ear. The Jingle-Bob was not a brand. It was a cut, a deep slit sliced through the ear so that the lower half hung loose and swung with every step the animal took, a piece of the animal itself turned into a signature no running iron could reach. A thief could reburn a hide in an hour, in the dark, with nothing but a fire and a bent wire. He could not reattach a severed piece of ear, could not make a whole ear pass inspection where a slit one had been recorded, could not undo the cut without the animal carrying the evidence of the undoing for the rest of its life. Stock inspectors along the cattle trails learned to know the Jingle-Bob on sight, a herd identifying itself before a rider ever checked a hide for a brand at all. The cutting itself was work done by hand at the roundups, where calves too young to carry a full brand were gathered by riders who knew every calf belonged to whoever had gotten to it first. A blade, not a hot iron, made the cut, fast enough that a crew could work through a full pen of calves before the branding fire burned down, and precise enough that two cowhands trained on the same outfit produced marks a stranger could not tell apart. It was unglamorous work, done in dust and bawling calves and the smoke of a branding fire lit for the long rail alongside it, and none of the men doing it owned a single animal they were marking. The signature protected an owner who would rarely swing the blade himself, written by other men's hands onto cattle he had never personally touched. No other major outfit on the Western Range could be named by its ears before its marks. A rancher built his reputation on a brand, a shape a buyer could describe in a letter and a rustler could copy in the dark. Chisum built his on a mutilation, a piece of cruelty turned into the most reliable anti-theft device the open range would produce, and the choice said something about the man making it. He was not interested in a mark that merely looked official. He wanted one a court could not argue with and a thief could not undo. And he was willing to put that requirement on every calf his herd produced rather than trust the paper alone. The Jingle-Bob solved the problem the running iron had created for every rancher on the Pecos. It did not solve the one still ahead of him. A mark, however uncopyable, only protects the cattle that carry it. It says nothing about the ground those cattle graze on, ground Chisum did not own, had never bought, and held only for as long as no one with a stronger claim rode in to contest it. The ear was safe. The range was not. Chapter 5. He claimed a river 100 miles long. The ear had solved theft. It had not solved geography, and by 1872 Chisum stopped waiting for an answer to that second problem to arrive on its own. A Jingle-Bob only worked on cattle a man already had somewhere to graze, and in the dry country west of the Texas herds he had built, grazing land was not sold in the way a farm was sold. There was no clerk's office on the Pecos to file a deed against, no survey a rancher could point to and say the line runs here. There was only the river itself, and whoever controlled the water controlled everything the water could grow. Chisum had spent his years as a Lamar County clerk learning what a piece of paper could do for a man who held one. On the Pecos, there was no paper to hold, so he made the river do the work a deed would have done anywhere else. He fixed his headquarters at Bosque Grande, a stretch of cottonwood and grass on the upper river, and from there he simply began claiming the ground downstream, not buying it, not filing on it, claiming it the way a man claims a chair by sitting in it long enough that no one else tries. His riders and his herds spread south along the water, and by the time the claim settled into something other ranchers on the range understood to be real, it ran for more than 100 miles. a private grazing territory the length of a small state, held by nothing but presence and the willingness to defend it. No fence marked where the claim began or ended. No surveyor had ever walked it. A rider coming down from Texas or up from the Mexican border learned where Chisum's range started the same way every other outfit learned it, by riding into it and finding Chisum's cattle already there, wearing the split ear and the long unbroken line, in numbers that made the point better than any posted sign could have. Other cattlemen respected the claim not because a court had ever ruled on it, but because contesting it meant contesting a man who already had more riders and more stock on the ground than anyone willing to test him. It was, by any ordinary measure, an absurd way to build an empire. 100 miles of river claimed by a man who owned, on paper, almost none of it. But the absurdity was the method. Deeded land in Texas was contested in courtrooms, fought over in surveys, split by inheritance and lawsuit for a generation after a man died. A grazing claim on open government range answered to none of that, not yet. Not on the Pecos in 1872, where the nearest federal land office was a rumor and the nearest law was whoever arrived first with the most cattle. Chisum understood something the deed holders of Texas had not needed to learn. On land nobody had gotten around to owning, the man who showed up and stayed became, for all practical purposes, the owner. The Pecos gave him what the Long Rail and the Jingle-Bob could never provide on their own, room enough to let a herd grow past the size any fenced Texas ranch could hold. Downstream, the grass ran uninterrupted and the water never stopped, and 100 miles of it was already more range than most cattlemen in the country would see in a lifetime. It was not, Chisum already understood, going to be enough. The herds he was building bred faster than 100 miles of river could feed them, and the same absence of law that had let him claim the ground in the first place would let him claim more of it the moment he needed to. The claim would not stay 100 miles for long. Within 3 years, it would run twice that distance, and the number of cattle grazing it would climb to a figure the nation itself would take notice of. He had claimed a river. He had not yet claimed what the river could become. Chapter 6. 80,000 head and one owner. The 100 miles was only the beginning. The 100 miles Chisum claimed from Bosque Grande in 1872 did not sit still, and neither did the herd that grazed it. Within 3 years the range doubled, exactly the way the claim itself had already promised it would, until it ran the full 200 miles down the Pecos, and the working center of it settled at a stretch of river the ranch hands called South Spring. The water there ran clear and steady through a country where most streams went to alkali mud by midsummer, and a herd of any real size needed exactly that kind of water to survive a Pecos July. Chisum had chosen the ground for the same reason he had chosen every mile before it, not because a deed said he could, but because he had gotten there first and stayed. By 1875, the number attached to that ground had grown difficult to say out loud without sounding like exaggeration. 80,000 head grazing 200 miles of river no surveyor had ever walked. A herd 16 times the size of the one he had run 15 years earlier, when 5,000 cattle valued at $35,000 was already enough to make him one of the richer men in Texas. A claim that had stood at 100 miles in 1872 and now, exactly as the river had already hinted it would, ran twice that far. Cattlemen who kept track of such things, and by then there were men in Texas and the territories whose entire business was keeping track of such things, described it plainly. The largest cattle operation in the United States, held by one man, answerable to no partnership, no bank, and no board. It was an empire with no wall, no gate, and no ledger anyone outside it had ever been allowed to see in full. A rider could cross 50 miles of Chisum Range and pass nothing but grass, river, and cattle wearing the split ear, and never once cross a fence line or read a posted sign. Word of the operation traveled well past the Pecos on its own. Buyers in Texas, agents in the territories, and editors of stock journals who had never set foot on the range all repeated the same figure to one another, 80,000 head, until the number itself became a kind of introduction, the thing a man said about Chisum before he said anything else. That absence of walls had built the whole operation and carried its reputation to men who had never seen a single one of its cattle. At this size, the same absence was also the thing that should have worried him most. 80,000 cattle could not be watched the way 5,000 could. A Jingle-Bob earmark told a buyer at a stockyard exactly whose herd he was looking at, but it told a rustler working a dark stretch of the Pecos at midnight almost nothing at all, because there was no one standing there to check an ear before the animal was 3 counties gone. 200 miles of unfenced river was more country than any crew of riders, however many Chisum kept on the payroll, could patrol end to end in a single week, and the herd itself kept spreading further along the water every season, following the grass rather than any line a foreman could draw on a map. Comanche raiding parties still crossed the Pecos country in those years, moving fast and moving light, gone from a stretch of range long before a rider could reach it to report what had happened. Rustlers who would never have risked touching a small, closely watched herd, one where a foreman could count heads by eye at the end of a day, found a 200-mile range to be exactly the kind of country a man could disappear a few hundred head into and never be caught. The same Jingle-Bob that made a stolen animal easy to identify at a stockyard did nothing to stop it from being driven off the range in the first place, proof after a theft rather than protection against one. Chisum did not yet have a number for what that undefended country was costing him. He would before long, and it would be reported the same way his herd size was reported, as a fact about the nation's largest cattle operation rather than one rancher's private misfortune. For now, in the summer of 1875, the count that mattered, the count that traveled from ranch to ranch and newspaper to newspaper, was the one that had made him famous. 80,000 head, 200 miles of river, one owner's mark on every animal grazing it. The open range that had built the empire asked nothing of anyone who came to take from it. Somewhere out on those 200 unfenced miles, on nights nobody wrote down and in numbers nobody had yet added up, the losses had already begun. Chapter 7. The Empire That Bled from Every Side. The number, when someone finally added it up, took 6 years to accumulate and one sentence to say. Between 1868 and 1874, Chisum's total stock losses reached $150,000, the largest such loss recorded anywhere in the nation. 4 times over, that loss alone would have bought back the entire herd he had run in Texas in 1860, 5,000 head valued at $35,000, the figure that had once made him one of the richer men in Texas. Against 6 years on the open Pecos range, that early fortune was now a rounding error. The mechanism behind the loss was the same one that had built the empire in the first place. No fences meant no boundary a Comanche raiding party had to cross in daylight, and no boundary meant no warning. Before 100 head vanished into country nobody patrolled. No brand recorded at any courthouse meant no title a rustler had to forge, only an earmark to avoid, or an animal to drive off before anyone thought to check its ears at all. No ledger anyone outside the operation had ever been allowed to see in full meant no early count of what was missing, only a running total that arrived, when it finally arrived, already too large to call an accident. What built the empire was what bled it. All three of the forces the open range had always invited took their share of it: the raiders, the rustlers, and the unwatched country itself. None of it arrived as a single dramatic loss. It arrived as a running subtraction that nobody working the Bosque Grande claim or the South Spring Range had reason to add together, until stock journals and the cattlemen who tracked such figures did the arithmetic for him, the same men who had carried the 80,000 head count from ranch to ranch only a season earlier. There was an irony in it the ledgers themselves never recorded. The operation was the largest in the country, and for the same reason its losses were the largest too. Smaller outfits lost cattle too. Outfits closer to town with fewer miles of dark river to defend, but their totals never reached a newspaper page because 100 head missing from a modest herd was a private misfortune, and $150,000 missing from the nation's largest cattle operation was a fact about the nation. A rancher with a small, close herd could know every animal by sight. A man running 80,000 across 200 miles of the Pecos could only know the total, and a total was the one thing a raiding party or a rustler could shrink without him noticing until the season's count came due. The record that would one day carry Chisum's life gave the loss the same word it gave his herd's size, the largest, and did not soften the second use to spare the first. The bleeding did not stop the herd from growing. Losses of that size, absorbed over 6 years by an operation still adding cattle faster than raiders and rustlers could take them, barely slowed a count that had already reached 80,000 head across 200 miles by 1875. But absorbing a loss and controlling it were never the same thing, and a man who had built an empire by refusing to fence it could not now build a wall 200 miles long to stop what the lack of one had cost him. Something would have to change about how the herd was held, not merely how it was grazed. Within months of the count that made him famous, Chisum would make exactly that change, and the empire that had bled from every side would, for the first time since the mark was first burned into a Texas hide, answer to men who had never set foot on the Pecos. Chapter 8. The Day He Sold His Own Herd. The men who now held a claim on Chisum's cattle had never ridden the Pecos, never inspected a Jingle-Bob ear at a river crossing, and never needed to. In November 1875, the same season the South Spring count was still being repeated in cattlemen's circulars as the largest herd in the United States, Chisum transferred more than 60,000 head to Hunter, Evans and Company, a beef commission house headquartered in St. Louis, a city most of those cattle would never see. A commission house of that kind kept a rail yard, a stockyard, and a set of buyers on the eastern markets, the machinery that turned a distant herd of grazing animals into a line of credit a rancher could draw against without ever driving a single steer to the Mississippi. To the men who read newspapers and stockyard reports, nothing on the range had changed. The mark still ran the same iron, the herd still grazed the same 200 miles of river grass, and the count still climbed toward 80,000. But in the ledger books kept behind a St. Louis office door, in columns of ink that never touched New Mexico territory, most of what still wore Chisum's earmark now belonged on paper to financiers 3 states away, a change no one counting heads on the Pecos had any way to see. A commission house did not raise cattle. It moved them, financed them, and carried the risk of a falling market, so a rancher did not have to carry it alone. For an operation that had just finished absorbing $150,000 in losses to raiders and rustlers and an unfenced range that swallowed strays without a trace, that kind of outside capital was not a retreat. It was a hedge against the exact bleeding the last 6 years had shown him no rider and no rifle could stop. 60,000 head under contract to a St. Louis firm could not vanish into a raiding party's trail the way an unclaimed steer could, and a market turning sour in Kansas City or Chicago was now a risk the commission house's own capital absorbed first. A signed contract did work an earmark alone had never been able to do. Still, something had shifted that no cattleman passing South Spring could see in the herd itself. The operation people believed they understood one man's cattle on one man's grass, answering to one man's mark, was no longer the whole picture. Behind the mark now stood a company, a set of financiers in a city on the Mississippi, a claim on the animals that existed nowhere on the open range and everywhere in a stack of paper an outsider would never think to ask for. A neighboring rancher riding the boundary of the claim, or a reporter counting heads for a Texas newspaper, had no way to see a contract sitting in a St. Louis office and no reason to ask whether the man they still called the owner of 80,000 head owned all of them outright anymore. The herd looked the same grazing the Pecos in December as it had in October. What owned it did not. Chisum kept running the operation exactly as he had before the transfer. The same foreman, the same Jingle-Bob crews, the same 200 unfenced miles. But the man who had built his standing on the mark had just found a second kind of protection, one that lived not in an animal's ear, but in a St. Louis contract, and he was going to need every form of protection he could find. 3 counties to the east, in a territory carved so large it was already the biggest county in the nation, another operation had reached the same lesson from the opposite direction. There, one business faction had learned that owning the credit, not the cattle, was how a man came to own an entire county's account. Chisum was about to find out exactly what that kind of ownership was prepared to do to anyone who competed with it. Chapter 9. The House That Owned the County. The lesson waiting 3 counties east had nothing to do with grass or water. In 1869, the territorial legislature had carved Lincoln County out of the southeastern corner of New Mexico Territory and drawn its lines so wide that no county anywhere in the United States covered more ground, 1/4 of the entire territory folded into a single jurisdiction with a single county seat, and, for most of the decade after, a single general store. A rancher 40 miles out who needed credit for seed, salt, or a winter's flour had exactly 1 door to knock on. A soldier at the nearest army post ate beef bought through exactly 1 contract. A cowhand paid in company scrip spent every cent of it at exactly 1 counter, because there was no second counter within a week's ride in any direction. The men who owned that counter did not need to own a single steer to own the county. They needed only to own the paper everyone else in it was required to sign. Everyone in the territory called the combine simply the house, the way a gambler names the table that always wins. 2 partners, Dolan and Riley, kept its books, held its beef contracts, and ran its 1 general store on the plaza in the town of Lincoln. And for most of the decade, nothing moved through the county, not an army contract, not a rancher's line of credit, not a Saturday's wages, that did not first pass through their ledger. It was the same lesson Chisum had just learned from a St. Louis contract, that a signature could own more than a herd ever could. The House had learned it first, learned it wider, and built an entire county's economy on top of it before anyone thought to ask what would happen the day a second signature entered the room. A man who fell behind on what he owed the store did not lose his cattle to a raiding party or an unfenced range, the 2 dangers Chisum's own herd had spent a decade bleeding to. He lost his standing in the 1 county where standing and credit were the same word, and there was nowhere else in a 1/4 of the territory to rebuild either one. What passed through Chisum's mind as he watched a monopoly tighten around a county bordering his own range, no surviving letter of his records. But the house did not need a written confession to sense what was coming. It only needed to watch the man with 80,000 head start asking a lawyer about a bank charter. Viewers who came to this story already knowing the outlaw and wanting the ledger behind him are exactly who this channel keeps digging for, and if that describes you, subscribing costs nothing. It only tells us there is an audience for the financier as much as for the gunfighter. Enter John Tunstall, a young Englishman who arrived in Lincoln with money of his own and no inherited fear of a monopoly an ocean away from where he had been raised. He opened a mercantile store on the same plaza as the house's own, priced to compete for customers the house had never before had to compete for. Alexander McSween, a lawyer already doing legal work for Chisum's interests in the county, joined Tunstall as his partner in the venture, and behind both men stood Chisum himself, who did not merely lend his name to it. He appeared as president of a new institution chartered to break the house's monopoly outright, the Lincoln County Bank, the first line of credit a rancher or a soldier or a cowhand in the county had ever been offered that did not run through Dolan and Riley's books. A man could now borrow against next season's calves instead of against his standing at one counter, sell his beef to whichever buyer offered the better price instead of the only buyer in reach, and owe his debts to a ledger the house did not keep. Dolan and Riley read the charter for exactly what it was. A store competed with a store on price. A bank competed with the house for the one thing that had made it the house in the first place, the exclusive right to decide who in Lincoln County could borrow, who could sell beef to the army, and who went without. They had built their monopoly over a decade and defended it against nothing larger than a rival's shelf of goods. Now they were looking at a rival's bank, backed by the largest cattle fortune on the Pecos, and they treated the charter for what it plainly was, not competition, but a threat to their own survival. Every dollar that moved through Chisum's bank instead of the house's store was a dollar the house could no longer count as owed to it, and a monopoly built on being the only door in the county could not survive a second door standing open across the same plaza. Threats to survival in Lincoln County were not settled in a courthouse or a ledger book. They were settled the way most things in the territory eventually were, on the open road, in front of witnesses who would remember exactly what they saw and argue for the rest of their lives over what it meant. Tunstall had opened his store to compete for customers. He had no way of knowing that the house would not answer him with a lower price. It would answer him on the road to town with a rifle. Chapter 10. The Man They Shot on the Trail. The rifle the house had promised did not wait long to speak. In February of 1878, riding a stretch of road in Lincoln County he had crossed without incident more times than he could count, John Tunstall met the answer the house had chosen to give his store, his bank charter, and the man 3 counties away whose money stood behind both of them. This is the killing this film opened with, before any of the reasons behind it had a name. The reasons have a name now. They are Dolan, Riley, and the ledger they had spent a decade guarding. He did not meet it alone. A posse rode out onto that road, riders carrying papers that named a debt against Tunstall's property and a claim of law that traced, badge by badge, back to a sheriff's office the house had controlled since before Chisum's charter ever existed. The men held warrants signed in the name of the county. The county, in Lincoln, still meant whoever held the ledger, and the ledger, for a decade, had belonged to Dolan and Riley. A store had competed with the house's prices. A bank had competed with the house's credit. Now the house answered both at once, on an empty road, with men wearing the county's own badge. Riding with Tunstall that day was one of Chisum's own hired hands, a cattle guard not yet 20 who had spent his short career watching herds at night rather than watching men, and who would spend the rest of his life known by a different name than the one he was born with. He watched the posse close the distance across the open ground. He watched Tunstall, a man with no history of violence and no reason yet to believe the law had stopped being the law, ride toward the riders rather than away from them. And he watched what came after, close enough to carry the memory the rest of his life, too far to change what happened. By the end of it, John Tunstall was dead on a road in a county where death by rifle had, for years, mostly belonged to raiding parties and rustlers thinning a rancher's herd, not to a young Englishman who had wanted only to sell flour and salt at a fair price. He was killed by men who carried a badge. The men who had signed his warrant and the men who profited from his silence never rode out onto that road themselves. They did not need to. That was the entire point of owning the sheriff instead of carrying the rifle. A monopoly that could deputize its own grievances had no reason to risk its own hands. There was, in the killing, a kind of proof neither side had wanted to supply so plainly. Chisum's bank charter had argued, on paper, that Lincoln County's credit belonged to more than one ledger. Tunstall's store had argued, in practice, that its customers belonged to more than one counter. For a decade, the House had answered every threat to its monopoly the same way, and it answered these two no differently by turning the county's own law on the men who had dared to compete with it. Chisum was not on the road that morning. No surviving account places him anywhere near it, and the record that does survive shows a man who financed the challenge to the House from a distance, in a bank charter and a store's shelves, never in a gunfight. He had put his money and his name behind Tunstall's mercantile and behind the Lincoln County Bank, and the war those two ventures had opened on paper now had its first body, paid for in a currency no charter had priced. The man who owned 80,000 head and a bank charter had never once needed to fire a shot to build either, and he did not need to ride out onto that road now to collect on what the shot bought him. Word of the killing reached Lincoln before the dust of the posse's horses had settled, carried by the same young cattle guard who had watched it happen. The county he rode into was no longer arguing over prices and paper. Men who had spent months competing over customers and credit began arming instead, because a monopoly that had just proven it would answer a store with a rifle had also just proven that no ledger in Lincoln County would settle what came next. The killing on a wagon road in February did not close the account the House had opened against Chisum's bank. It opened a second one, payable in Lincoln itself, in a currency the county had not used in years. Within 5 months, the plaza where a mercantile had once simply undercut a mercantile would spend 5 days on fire, and the boy who had watched Tunstall die on the road would be inside the house at the center of it, no longer only a cattle guard. Chapter 11. 5 Days of Fire in Lincoln. The 5 months the last chapter promised did not take long to burn away. By the middle of July, 1878, the same cattle guard who had watched Tunstall die on the road that February was standing inside a house in the center of Lincoln, and the house was surrounded. The men who had gathered around Tunstall's cause after his death called themselves the Regulators, a posse assembled to answer the posse that had killed him, and their leader now was Alexander McSween, the lawyer whose name had stood beside Tunstall's on the store's papers and the bank's charter since before either venture opened its doors. Dolan and Riley answered the Regulators the same way the House had answered every threat to its monopoly for a decade, through the county's own badge. For the better part of a week, the two sides had traded gunfire in the plaza in short, inconclusive bursts, men firing from behind adobe walls and store windows without ever settling the argument the way a courtroom or a ledger might have. What began the 3rd week of July as another skirmish over the same store and the same bank charter hardened day by day into something closer to a siege. For 5 days, the two sides fought through the plaza that had spent a year competing over flour prices and beef contracts, house to house and street to street, until the fighting narrowed to a single building. McSween, his wife, and a dozen of the men who had ridden for Tunstall's side barricaded themselves inside McSween's own home, the last defensible ground in a town neither faction would give up. By the 5th day, the house had a detachment of soldiers from Fort Stanton at its back, and against soldiers and a house full of men with nowhere left to retreat, Dolan's faction reached for the one weapon no bank charter and no store ledger could answer. They set the house on fire. There was, in that choice, a kind of admission the house would never have written into a courthouse filing. Dolan and Riley had spent a decade defending a monopoly with prices and interest rates and the sheriff's badge, instruments that at least pretended to be the ordinary machinery of a county doing business. Burning a family out of its own home in the dark was the house reaching for the one weapon that machinery had never included. It burned from one end toward the other through the last night of the siege, room by room, driving McSween's men back through smoke toward the door they had spent 5 days refusing to open. McSween went out through that door in the fire's final hour and was shot down in his own yard, the lawyer who had put his name on Chisum's bank charter dying a few hundred feet from the store counter where that charter had once undercut Dolan's prices. The cattle guard who had watched Tunstall killed on the road in February now watched a second death, closer than the first, and this time he was one of the men running for the same burning door. He got clear of the house and out of Lincoln. The record does not linger on how. It notes only that he lived, and that within a few years the county and then the country would know him by a name his mother had never given him. Chisum stood nowhere near any of it. Through that same July, while the regulators he had financed burned inside a house he had never once set foot in, Chisum and the commission house that now carried his herd, Hunter, Evans, and Company, were pulling cattle off the open range along the Pecos, clearing stock out of a county that had stopped being safe for anything that could be shot, stolen, or driven off in the smoke of a war. The man whose bank charter had opened the argument spent the 5-day battle guarding the fortune. The argument had always really been a bout. He had financed a fight and declined to stand inside it, and 80,000 head across 200 miles of river went on grazing at a careful distance from the plaza that was burning in his name. It was a pattern the whole war had followed from its first shot on the wagon road. The men Chisum's money armed did the dying, and the man who supplied the money did the ledgers. The house held Lincoln when the fire finally went out. McSween was dead. Tunstall was dead. The bank charter that had dared to compete with Dolan and Riley had lost its lawyer and its storekeeper both within 5 months to 2 separate killings on 2 separate streets of the same small county. By any ledger the house could produce, the house had won the war it had started with a rifle on a wagon road, and Dolan's monopoly on Lincoln County's credit stood unbroken in every way a courthouse could measure. What the house had not touched, in 5 days of siege and a single night of fire, was the man whose money had made the fight possible in the first place. Chisum's name was on the bank charter that started the argument, and nowhere on the casualty list that ended it. He had lost his lawyer, his storekeeper, and the store itself, and he had lost none of his herd, none of his standing, and none of his distance from the smoke. The empire on the Pecos would open its next season the same size it had closed the last one. But a war fought on someone else's money does not end when the fighting stops, and the men who had bled for 5 days inside a burning house were about to learn what the man who had financed them believed he actually owed. The cattle guard who had escaped McSween's house had done more for Chisum's side of the war in 5 months than most hired hands did in 5 years. He believed that service carried a price. Chisum was about to disagree. and the alliance the house's rifles had failed to break was already cracking from the inside. Chapter 12. The Outlaw He Refused to Pay. The price the cattle guard believed he was owed came due within weeks of the fire that burned McSween out of his own house, and Chisum, the man whose money had started the fight, refused to pay it. Whatever loyalty had carried the young rider through the war had never really been Chisum's to claim. The man he had ridden with and gone to war to avenge was John Tunstall, the storekeeper shot dead on the road that February. Chisum was the colder thing in the arrangement, the money 3 counties off that paid for the fight, a name on a bank charter rather than a man a boy would follow into a burning house. To a paymaster, a rider brought an expectation of being paid, and that expectation was very nearly the whole of the bond between them. It did not survive the accounting. What the kid wanted, once the smoke over Lincoln had cleared and the regulators had scattered to whatever ranches would still hide them, was $500, wages he said Chisum owed him for 5 months of guarding a herd and fighting a war that herd's money had bought. $500 was not a fortune measured against 80,000 head grazing 200 miles of the Pecos, and not against an operation that had already absorbed $150,000 in raid and rustler losses without buckling. It was the kind of sum an outfit that size settled at a hitching post without a second thought, a few bills counted out of a strongbox and handed across, and by every account the kid expected exactly that: a short conversation and a shorter walk to collect it. He did not get it. The refusal survives in Chisum's own words, spoken within the year and unaltered in the 150 years since. If you talked about that money until your hair was as white as mine, you could not convince me that I owed it to you. It was not an argument about the war or the burning house, or the 5 months a boy had spent riding guard on cattle that were never once shot at while men died in town defending Chisum's bank charter. It was a ledger answer, delivered the way a man who had once kept county records in Lamar County would deliver one. The debt was not written down anywhere Chisum recognized, and what was not written down did not exist. The refusal was a warning sign. Chisum ignored it. A man can run the largest cattle operation in the United States and still misjudge the one hired hand in it who has a gun, a grudge, and nothing left to lose, and Chisum misjudged this one completely. Within weeks of the refusal, the hired hand Chisum would not pay turned to rustling Chisum's own herd, cutting Jingle-Bob marked cattle out from under the earmark built to make theft impossible, and driving small bunches of them off at night, across the same open range he had spent 5 months learning to guard. The mark that had defeated every rustler in the territory for a decade had just trained its most effective one. History does not remember that rider by the name his mother gave him. It remembers Billy the Kid, and it remembers the outlaw, not the wage dispute that made him one. Chisum's name barely survives in most tellings of that story at all. So here is the ledger the record leaves for you to settle. Was Chisum a baron entitled to refuse a debt his own books did not carry? A businessman doing exactly what any man with 80,000 head and a bank charter would do? Or was he the man who broke faith with a boy who had bled for his cause for 5 months? Over $500 he could have paid out of a single week's beef contract without noticing the loss. Pecos Valley families still argue both sides of that ledger over dinner tables their grandfathers set, and the record does not settle it for them. What the record does settle is the arithmetic. Chisum kept his $500. He lost a hired hand who had done more for his side of the war than most men on his payroll ever did, and he made an enemy who would spend what little time he had left proving exactly how much damage a man with nothing left to lose could do to a fortune built on an open range and a single trusted mark. Chisum had less time left than either of them knew, and the reckoning already closing in on him would not carry a gun at all. Chapter 13. The King, the Fences Outlived. The reckoning already closing in on John Chisum did not carry a gun. It carried instead a tumor growing on the side of his neck that no runner and no fast horse to the nearest doctor could outrun. The record that survives him is, in its own way, as closed as his ledgers. Chisum never married, yet the Handbook of Texas records what the family's own papers never did, stating it is widely believed that he fathered 2 daughters by one of his slaves, a woman named Jency. The 80,000 head and the 200 miles of grass counted so carefully across this film were written down to the dollar. Jency and her daughters were not no fuller a record than that one guarded sentence, which is as near to a name as the era's surviving papers allow a woman Chisum owned. His name did not travel any better than his household did. The trail his cattle helped open came down through history as the Chisum Trail, and for a century and a half it has been confused with the far larger, far more famous Chisum Trail, laid out by a different man entirely, a part Cherokee trader named Jesse Chisum, who never drove a single one of Chisum's animals. It is a small erasure. It sits beside a larger one. Even Hollywood, when it finally came looking for the story, found the outlaw first. In 1970, a film called Chisum put John Wayne in the saddle in his place, a gunfighter's face standing in for a banker's, telling a war Chisum financed as though he had ridden into it himself. Chisum did not die in that war, or in a courtroom over the $500 he refused to pay. On the 22nd of December, 1884, at 60 years old, he died in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, hundreds of miles from the nearest acre of the Pecos, where he had gone looking for a cure the range itself could not supply. He had spent decades learning to hold 80,000 animals together on nothing but grass, water, and a mark no rustler could copy. None of it traveled with him to Arkansas, and none of it slowed the growth in his neck. There was a reason the empire had always rested on grass and water, and a mark, and never on a deed. The clerk who had once entered other men's land transactions into a Lamar County ledger went on to build the largest cattle operation in the United States without ever once filing a claim to the ground beneath it. The Pecos range he ran, 80,000 head across, belonged to the federal government, to the territory, or to no one in particular, exactly as it had when he arrived with 5,000 animals and a mark instead of a title. He had spent a lifetime perfecting possession without ownership, and it worked for as long as no one else in the territory owned the ground either. That changed within a few years of his funeral. Wire arrived on the Pecos. Barbed wire, strung mile after mile across the same unfenced country he had claimed with nothing more than a boundary staked out from Bosque Grande, and 80,000 animals wearing his mark, closed the very system his fortune had depended on. The riders who had spent their working lives following his herds across open range, the Jingle-Bob outfits nobody wrote down by name any more than they wrote down Jency, found that range fenced within a generation, their trade fenced along with it. Chisum had built an empire on the principle that land belonged to whoever could hold it by force of numbers and reputation. The wire made that principle obsolete, and because he had never owned a foot of the ground it ran through, he left no deed behind for anyone to defend it with. If your family rode for the Jingle-Bob outfits along the Pecos, or if your line runs back to Jency rather than to the Chisum name the history books kept, the record this film drew from did not have your name to work with. It should have. Say what has come down to you in the comments below this video. Subscribe, and the next film will open on another fortune built the same way this one was, on paper, water, and a mark somebody eventually stopped honoring. The Pecos still runs the same 200 miles it always did. The mark is gone. The bank is gone. The fences that finally closed the range he never bothered to build outlived the king who never needed them.